At exactly 1:47 a.m., a man was found lying motionless inside a subway station in London. Security believed he was dead. But what they didn't know was that a few minutes later, that man would open his eyes again. The city of London always felt different after midnight. During the day, the streets were alive with noise, cars honking, people rushing to work, buses stopping every few minutes. But after midnight, the city slowed down. The bright lights were still there, but the energy faded, leaving behind an eerie quietness. Deep beneath the city, inside the long tunnels of the London Underground, the silence felt even heavier. Daniel Whitaker had worked as a night security officer for nearly 10 years. Most nights were predictable. Sometimes he would find a drunk passenger sleeping on a bench. Occasionally a lost tourist would wander through the wrong platform. But nothing truly dangerous ever happened down here. At least, not until tonight. Daniel walked slowly along platform B, his flashlight sweeping across the tiled floor. The station was almost empty now. The last train had passed nearly 20 minutes ago. Only the faint hum of the station lights and the distant echo of dripping water filled the underground corridor. Daniel glanced at his watch. 1:47 a.m. He sighed. Just one more patrol around the platform before returning to the security room. But as his flashlight reached the far end of the platform, he froze. There was someone lying on the floor. A man. Daniel quickly walked closer. The man looked to be in his early 40s. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, as if he had been wandering outside for hours. "Sir?" Daniel said, kneeling beside him. No response. Daniel gently shook the man's shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" Still nothing. Daniel leaned closer and placed 2 fingers against the man's neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. The man's skin felt cold. Daniel immediately grabbed his radio. "Control, this is Daniel at Platform B. I have an unconscious male here. Possibly deceased. Requesting ambulance support." The radio crackled. "Copy that, Daniel. Ambulance is on the way." Daniel exhaled slowly. Sadly, this kind of situation wasn't unheard of in a big city like London. Sometimes homeless people slept inside stations during the cold nights. Sometimes they simply never woke up. But something about this man felt wrong. His skin looked unusually pale. Almost gray. Daniel moved the flashlight closer to the man's arm. That's when he noticed it. A wound. A small bite mark on the man's hand. It looked fresh. Daniel frowned. Strange. Then suddenly, the man's fingers twitched. Daniel immediately leaned back. Maybe just a muscle reflex, he thought. But then, the man's eyes slowly opened. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The man's eyes looked empty. Not confused. Not scared. Just empty. "Sir?" Daniel said cautiously. The man suddenly sat upright. His movement was stiff and unnatural, like someone struggling to control their own body. Daniel stood up slowly. "Easy, help is coming." The man didn't respond. Instead, his head tilted slightly to one side. Almost like he was studying Daniel. For a brief moment, the station became completely silent. Then suddenly, the man lunged forward. Daniel barely had time to react. The man's teeth sank deep into Daniel's forearm. "Aff!" Daniel screamed in pain. The bite was brutal. The man bit down like a wild animal, tearing through skin and flesh. Daniel shoved him away with all his strength. The man fell backward onto the floor. Daniel stumbled away, clutching his bleeding arm. "What the hell is wrong with you?" The man slowly stood up again. But something about him was different now. His movements were slower. Stiffer. His mouth was covered in blood. He began walking toward Daniel. Step. 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 Stay back. Daniel shouted. But the man kept moving. Not fast. But relentless. Daniel turned and ran toward the security hallway. Behind him, he could hear footsteps. Dragging. Uneven. But always getting closer. A few minutes later, the sound of ambulance sirens echoed outside the station. Paramedics rushed down the stairs carrying medical equipment. They found Daniel sitting against a wall, pale and shaking. "Sir, what happened?" one of them asked. Daniel pointed toward the dark corridor. "A man, he attacked me." "Something's wrong with him." The paramedics shined their flashlights into the tunnel. But the man was gone. Only a trail of blood remained on the floor. "Let's get you to the hospital," one of them said. They carefully lifted Daniel onto a stretcher and rushed him to the ambulance. The doors slammed shut. The vehicle sped away into the quiet streets of London. But none of them noticed something in the shadows. Far inside the empty station corridor, a figure slowly emerged. The man. He stood perfectly still in the darkness, watching the exit, watching the world above. His breathing was slow. His body trembled slightly. Then, he began walking, step by step, toward the stairs, toward the city, toward the millions of people sleeping peacefully above ground. None of them knew it yet. But that night, something had awakened beneath London. Something hungry. And the outbreak had just begun. At 2:32 a.m. Doctors at a hospital in London declared the injured security guard dead. But 5 minutes later, the body on the hospital bed suddenly sat up. The ambulance sped through the quiet streets of London, its blue lights flashing against the empty buildings. Inside the vehicle, Daniel Whitaker lay on the stretcher, barely conscious. His breathing was fast and shallow. One of the paramedics pressed gauze against the deep bite wound on his forearm. "Blood pressure dropping," she said urgently. The other paramedic leaned closer to Daniel. "Sir, can you hear me?" Daniel's eyes flickered open for a moment. His pupils looked strange, unfocused. "The man," Daniel whispered weakly. "What man?" the paramedic asked. "He was dead." Daniel's voice faded. His body began to tremble. At first it looked like shock. But then the shaking became violent. His entire body convulsed. "Hey! Stay with us," the paramedic shouted. The heart monitor began beeping faster. Daniel's temperature was rising rapidly. "His fever spiking," the female paramedic said. "This is not normal." Within minutes, the ambulance arrived at St. Mary's Hospital. The emergency room doors burst open as paramedics rushed Daniel inside. "Male patient, mid-30s, one paramedic called out. Severe bite wound, high fever, possible infection." Doctors and nurses quickly surrounded the stretcher. Dr. Amelia Hart stepped forward. She had worked in emergency medicine for nearly 15 years. But something about this patient immediately caught her attention. Daniel's skin looked pale, almost gray. And his eyes rolled back as his body continued to shake. "Let's get him into trauma room 3, she said. The team quickly moved Daniel onto a hospital bed. A nurse began cleaning the wound on his arm. "What kind of bite is that?" the nurse asked quietly. "It looks like a human bite," another doctor said. Amelia frowned. Human bites could be dangerous, but they rarely caused symptoms this extreme. Daniel's heart rate suddenly spiked. The monitor beeped rapidly. Heart rate 150, the nurse reported. Daniel suddenly jerked upward. His eyes snapped open. For a brief moment, everyone in the room froze. His expression was pure terror. "He's conscious," the nurse said. But Daniel wasn't looking at them. His eyes stared at something invisible in the corner of the room. "The man," Daniel whispered. "Which man?" Amelia asked. "The one who bit me." His voice cracked. He was already dead." The doctors exchanged confused looks. Before anyone could respond, Daniel's body suddenly arched violently. The heart monitor screamed. Then, a long, continuous tone. "Flatline." The room fell silent. "Time of death, 2:32 a.m., Amelia said quietly. The nurse pulled a white sheet over Daniel's body. For a moment, no one spoke. Just another patient lost in the emergency room. The team slowly began leaving the room. "Let's notify the authorities," Amelia said. "If that bite came from another person, we need to track them down." The last nurse switched off one of the overhead lights before leaving. Now the trauma room was quiet. Only the faint hum of medical equipment filled the air. 5 minutes passed. Then, Daniel's fingers twitched. At first, it was barely noticeable. Then his entire hand moved. Slowly. The white sheet covering his body shifted. Daniel's chest rose. Then fell. Suddenly. His eyes snapped open. But something was wrong. Very wrong. The eyes that stared at the ceiling were no longer human. They looked empty. Cold. Like an animal searching for prey. Outside the room, a nurse named Sarah walked down the hallway carrying a clipboard. She stopped when she heard a strange noise from Trauma Room 3. A soft scratching sound. She frowned. "That's strange." She slowly pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit. "Hello?" she called. No response. Sarah stepped inside. Then she froze. The hospital bed was empty. The white sheet lay crumpled on the floor. "Hello?" Her voice trembled slightly. She turned toward the corner of the room. And that's when she saw him. Daniel was standing there. His back facing her. Completely still. "Sir," she said cautiously. "You shouldn't be standing." Daniel slowly turned around. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. His face was pale. His mouth was stained with blood. And his eyes were completely lifeless. "Sir, you need to lie back down," Sarah said, taking a step closer. Daniel suddenly lunged forward. His movements were fast. Violent. Before Sarah could scream, Daniel grabbed her shoulders and sank his teeth into her neck. Her scream echoed through the hospital corridor. Outside the room, doctors turned toward the sound. "What was that?" someone asked. The door suddenly burst open. Sarah stumbled out into the hallway. Blood poured from her neck. She collapsed onto the floor. Behind her, Daniel walked out of the trauma room. His movements were stiff. Unnatural. But his eyes were locked onto the people in the hallway. For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos exploded. "Call security. Someone restrain him." 2 hospital guards rushed forward. One of them grabbed Daniel's arm. "Sir, calm down." Daniel turned and bit him instantly. The guard screamed. Patients in the waiting area began panicking. Doctors rushed to pull people away. But the infection had already begun spreading. Within minutes, several people who had been bitten collapsed. Their bodies shaking violently. Their temperatures rising. And then, they stopped breathing. But the nightmare had only just begun. Because a few minutes later, those bodies began to move again. Inside St. Mary's Hospital, the first wave of the outbreak had begun. And outside, the city of London was still asleep, unaware that something horrifying had just been unleashed. Something that would soon escape the hospital walls. Something that would spread through the streets, through the trains, through the crowds. And before the sun even rose over London, the infection would already be everywhere. The outbreak had begun. At 4:10 a.m., the emergency department of a hospital in London stopped answering calls. Inside the building, doctors were no longer treating patients. They were trying to survive. Inside St. Mary's Hospital, the situation was collapsing faster than anyone could understand. Only minutes earlier, it had been a normal emergency room, busy, noisy, but controlled. Now it felt like something out of a nightmare. Patients were screaming. 2 security guards were lying on the floor. Both of them had deep bite wounds. One of them was still conscious, gasping for breath. The other one wasn't moving at all. "What the hell is happening?" a young nurse whispered beside her. Amelia didn't answer. She couldn't. Because she had just watched a man, someone who had been declared dead minutes earlier, bite through a guard's neck like a wild animal. And then keep moving. "Lock down the emergency wing," Amelia finally said. "Now." A nurse quickly rushed toward the security control panel. Meanwhile, several doctors tried to restrain the infected patients who had collapsed earlier. But something strange was happening. Their bodies were shaking violently. One of them suddenly stopped breathing. The heart monitor went silent. Flatline. Another death. But Amelia had a terrible feeling. "Everyone step back," she said quietly. A few seconds passed. Then the patient's fingers began to twitch. One of the nurses gasped. "No. That can't be." The patient's eyes suddenly opened. Just like Daniel. Empty. Cold. And hungry. He sat up abruptly and grabbed the nearest doctor. Within seconds, another scream echoed through the emergency room. Panic exploded. "Get away from them. Call the police. Seal the doors." But it was already too late. The infection was spreading faster than anyone could react. Several patients who had been bitten began collapsing one by one. Each one dying. And each one coming back. Inside the chaos, Amelia grabbed a nurse named Lucas. "We need to understand what this is," she said. Lucas looked terrified. "Understand it? People are dying. And coming back," Amelia replied. Lucas stared at her. Neither of them wanted to say the word forming in their minds. But the evidence was undeniable. The victims weren't just sick. They were changing. Another scream echoed from the waiting area. Amelia turned toward the sound. A group of infected patients had pushed through the emergency doors. They moved slowly, stumbling and dragging their feet. But their eyes were fixed on the crowd. A woman in the waiting room tried to run. One of the infected lunged at her. She fell to the floor. Blood splashed across the tiles. The entire waiting area erupted in panic. People rushed toward the exits. Chairs overturned. Glass shattered. Security alarms began blaring through the building. Outside the hospital, the quiet streets of London were starting to wake up. A taxi driver parked near the entrance watched as people suddenly burst out of the hospital doors. They were screaming. Running. Some of them covered in blood. "What the hell?" the driver muttered. Then the hospital doors burst open again. A man stumbled outside. His clothes were torn. Blood covered his face. He collapsed on the pavement. The taxi driver jumped out of his car. Hey! Are you okay? The man slowly looked up. His eyes were pale, unfocused. And before the driver could react, the man lunged forward. Inside the hospital, Amelia and Lucas were backing away down a hallway. The emergency wing was completely lost. Dozens of infected patients were roaming through the corridors. Some were dragging their feet. Others moved faster. But all of them had the same empty stare. "This isn't possible," Lucas whispered. Amelia shook her head. "Whatever this infection is, it's reanimating the brain." Lucas looked horrified. "You're saying they're alive?" Amelia hesitated. "No," she said quietly. "They're not alive." Another loud crash echoed from the far end of the hallway. A group of infected had broken through the glass doors leading into the surgical wing. Now the infection was spreading deeper into the hospital. Lucas grabbed Amelia's arm. "We need to get out of here." She nodded. But as they turned the corner, they suddenly stopped. More infected were coming from the opposite hallway. Slow. Dragging. Blocking their path. Lucas whispered, "We're trapped." The hospital lights flickered above them. Emergency sirens echoed through the building. And the infected kept moving closer. Outside, the sun had not yet risen over London. Most of the city was still asleep. The early morning trains were beginning to run. Buses were preparing their routes. Workers were starting their commute. None of them knew what was happening inside that hospital. None of them knew the infection had already escaped. Because in the parking lot, several bitten victims had already stumbled away into the dark streets. Walking slowly. Heading toward the crowded heart of the city. And within the next few hours, the entire city of London would begin to fall. At 6:12 a.m., the first emergency broadcast was sent across London. Police believed a violent riot had broken out near the hospital. What they didn't know was that the city was already infected. Dawn slowly crept over the skyline of London. The first rays of sunlight reflected off the glass towers and old brick buildings that filled the city. For millions of people, it looked like the beginning of a normal day. Commuters stepped out of apartment buildings with coffee cups in their hands. Buses began moving through the streets. The underground train started carrying passengers across the city. But something was wrong. At the Metropolitan Police Control Center, emergency calls were flooding the system. 911, what is your emergency? The operator listened carefully. A woman's voice screamed through the phone. He attacked someone. He bit him. There's blood everywhere. The call suddenly ended. The operator immediately logged the report. But before she could move to the next task, another phone rang. Then another. And another. Within minutes, dozens of calls were coming in from different parts of the city. Reports of violent attacks. People biting others. Uncontrolled aggression. The operator turned to her supervisor. "We're getting multiple assault reports across central London." The supervisor frowned. "Gang violence?" "Maybe," the operator replied. But the reports kept coming. Different neighborhoods. Different victims. All describing the same horrifying detail. The attackers were biting people. Meanwhile, outside St. Mary's Hospital, police cars began arriving one after another. Several officers rushed toward the building. The scene outside was chaos. Dozens of people had gathered outside the entrance. Some were injured. Some were crying. Others were simply staring at the hospital in shock. An officer approached a woman sitting on the pavement. "What happened here?" The woman looked up at him with trembling eyes. "They're killing people inside." The officer frowned. "Who is?" She whispered one word. "Patience." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Inside the hospital, the situation had become even worse. Dr. Amelia Hart and Lucas were still trapped inside the hallway. The infected had begun spreading throughout multiple floors. Several hospital staff had locked themselves inside supply rooms. Others were trying to escape through stairwells. But the infected kept appearing. Slowly. Relentlessly. Lucas peeked around the corner. "There are too many of them," he whispered. Amelia looked down the hallway. Bodies were scattered across the floor. Some of them were completely still. Others were starting to move. Her stomach twisted. "We need to get to the roof," she said. Lucas stared at her. "The roof? If we can signal a helicopter, maybe we can get evacuated." Lucas nodded slowly. It was their only chance. They quietly moved down the hallway, trying to avoid the infected wandering nearby. But the sounds of chaos echoed through the building. Glass breaking. People screaming. Somewhere in the distance. Gunshots. Outside the hospital, the police had finally entered the building. Officer Grant was one of the first inside. He had responded to dozens of violent incidents in his career. Blood covered the floor. Medical equipment was scattered everywhere. And several bodies were lying motionless. "Jesus," one officer whispered. Suddenly, a body on the floor moved. Officer Grant stepped closer. "Sir?" The man's eyes opened. Milky. Empty. The man lunged forward. Grant barely reacted in time. He fired his weapon. The gunshot echoed through the hallway. The infected man collapsed. But the sound attracted something else. From the dark corridors, more infected began appearing. Slowly walking toward the officers. Officer Grant's partner whispered, "What the hell are they?" Grant raised his gun again. "I don't know." More infected emerged from the hallway. 5. 10. Maybe more. Grant backed toward the exit. "We need backup." Outside the hospital, police sirens filled the morning air. News helicopters began circling above the area. One reporter spoke urgently into a camera. "We are currently outside St. Mary's Hospital in London, where authorities are responding to what appears to be a violent incident." Behind her, something unexpected happened. A man staggered out of the hospital doors. His clothes were covered in blood. He collapsed onto the sidewalk. Several bystanders rushed toward him. "Call an ambulance." But the man suddenly grabbed one of them and bit into his shoulder. The crowd erupted in panic. The reporter turned toward the camera, her voice shaking. "This situation appears to be escalating rapidly." Meanwhile, several infected patients had already wandered away from the hospital. Some moved into nearby streets. Others headed toward the subway entrances. And the morning commuters walking through London had no idea they were about to walk directly into the outbreak. Because the infection was no longer contained. It was spreading. Street by street. Station by station. And within the next few hours, the entire city would begin to panic. By 8:03 a.m., police across London were receiving hundreds of emergency calls every minute. At first, they believed it was a riot. But soon they realized the city was under attack. Morning traffic had fully begun in London. Cars filled the roads. Buses carried commuters to work. The underground trains were packed with passengers heading toward the city center. For most people, it looked like an ordinary weekday morning. But the chaos that had started at St. Mary's Hospital was already spreading across the city. At a busy street near Paddington, a police officer named Sergeant Mark Collins stepped out of his patrol car. He had been responding to reports of violent assaults for nearly an hour. The radio in his car wouldn't stop talking. Multiple injuries reported near Hyde Park. Possible riot near Baker Street Station. Units needed immediately at Oxford Street. Mark grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, what exactly is going on today?" The voice on the other end sounded overwhelmed. "We're not sure yet. Reports say attackers are biting people." Mark frowned. "Biting? That's what witnesses are saying." Before Mark could respond, a scream echoed down the street. He turned quickly. A man was running toward him. Behind him, 3 people were chasing him. Their movements looked strange. Unsteady. Almost unnatural. "Help!" the man shouted. Mark stepped forward. "Stop right there." The 3 figures didn't slow down. As they got closer, Mark realized something was terribly wrong. Their clothes were torn. Blood covered their mouths. And their eyes looked completely empty. One of them lunged forward and tackled the running man to the ground. Mark ran toward them. "Get off him." He grabbed the attacker and pulled him back. The man turned toward Mark instantly. Then he tried to bite him. Mark shoved him away in shock. What the hell? The attacker came at him again. This time Mark had no choice. He pulled out his pistol. "Stop." The attacker kept moving. Mark fired. The gunshot echoed through the street. The attacker collapsed. For a brief moment, everything went silent. The other 2 attackers froze. Then they slowly turned toward Mark and began walking toward him. More screams erupted from nearby sidewalks. People began running. Some dropped their bags and phones as they fled. A bus driver slammed his brakes as passengers rushed toward the exits. Within seconds, the entire street descended into chaos. Mark grabbed his radio. "Dispatch. We have violent attackers on Paddington Street. Suspects appear extremely aggressive." The voice on the radio responded with panic. "Officer Collins, similar reports are coming in from multiple locations across London." Mark looked around. More figures were appearing down the road. Some stumbled out of alleyways. Others emerged from nearby buildings. All moving slowly. All covered in blood. "Dispatch," Mark said quietly. "I think we have a bigger problem." Meanwhile, across the city, the situation was becoming even worse. At a crowded underground station, commuters were waiting for the next train. A woman suddenly collapsed onto the platform. Passengers rushed toward her to help. But seconds later, she grabbed a man's arm and bit down hard. People screamed. The crowd scattered. Security guards tried to intervene. But the infection had already begun spreading through the station. In another part of London, a double-decker bus had crashed into a row of parked cars. Passengers were running out of the vehicle. But several of them were already infected. They began attacking the others on the street. The violence was spreading everywhere. Police radios across the city were overwhelmed with calls. Reports of attacks. Reports of people collapsing. Reports of individuals coming back to life after dying. Inside the police command center, officers stared at the incoming reports in disbelief. "This can't be real," one officer muttered. But the live footage from street cameras told a different story. Crowds of people running. Others chasing them. And those who were attacked soon joining the attackers. Back on Paddington Street, Sergeant Mark Collins stood beside his patrol car, breathing heavily. The 2 infected he had shot were no longer moving. But new ones were appearing at the end of the street. Walking slowly toward him. The city around him was falling apart. Sirens echoed everywhere. Helicopters flew overhead. People were running in every direction. Mark picked up his radio one more time. "Dispatch, we need military support." There was a long pause. Then the dispatcher finally replied. "Officer Collins, the government is already preparing a citywide emergency response." Mark watched as more infected figures filled the street. And for the first time that morning, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't just violence. This wasn't a riot. This was an outbreak. And the entire city of London was about to become a battlefield. By 10:15 a.m., large parts of London had already fallen into chaos. Streets were filled with abandoned cars. Police lines were collapsing. And inside a small supermarket, 5 strangers realized they might be the last people still alive in that neighborhood. The streets of London no longer looked like the same city that had woken up just a few hours earlier. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road. Some had crashed into each other during the panic. Others were left with their doors open, belongings scattered across the pavement. Sirens echoed in the distance. Somewhere far away, smoke was rising into the sky. But the worst part was the silence between the chaos. Because sometimes the city became completely quiet. And in that silence, you could hear them. Slow footsteps. Dragging across the pavement. Inside a small corner supermarket near a residential street, a group of survivors had barricaded the entrance using shelves and carts. The store lights were turned off. Only faint daylight entered through the front windows. 5 people sat inside the dark store. None of them knew each other before today. But now their survival depended on each other. The first was Sergeant Mark Collins, the police officer who had escaped the violence earlier that morning. His uniform was stained with blood, and his pistol rested in his hand. Next to him sat a university student named Ethan. He looked barely 20 years old. His hands were shaking as he held a bottle of water. Across from them was Maria, a bus driver who had abandoned her vehicle when passengers began attacking each other. Beside her sat Dr. Amelia Hart. She had finally escaped from the hospital after witnessing the beginning of the outbreak. And the last member of the group was a young mother named Claire, holding her small daughter tightly in her arms. The little girl hadn't spoken for nearly an hour. She just stared at the floor. Mark carefully peeked through the glass window near the entrance. Outside, several infected figures wandered slowly along the street. "They're still out there," he whispered. Maria rubbed her face nervously. "How many are there now?" Mark shook his head. "Too many." Ethan spoke quietly. "What exactly are they?" Dr. Amelia looked down at the floor. For hours she had tried to understand the infection. The images from the hospital kept replaying in her mind. Patients dying. Then coming back. "It's some kind of virus," she said. "But I've never seen anything like it." Ethan swallowed. "You mean, they're not just crazy?" Amelia shook her head slowly. "No." She looked toward the window. "They're infected." Maria leaned forward. "But they died." "I know," Amelia said quietly. "That's the problem." The room fell silent. Claire gently covered her daughter's ears. "What are we supposed to do?" she asked softly. No one answered. Outside the store, one of the infected suddenly stumbled against a parked car. The loud noise echoed through the empty street. Everyone inside the store froze. Another infected slowly turned toward the sound. Then another. Within seconds, several of them began drifting closer to the supermarket. Mark lowered his voice. "They're attracted to noise." Ethan's breathing became faster. "How do you know?" "I've been watching them," Mark said. "They react to movement and sound." Maria whispered, "So what happens when they find us?" Mark didn't answer. Because he already knew. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the store. Everyone jumped. Claire gasped. What was that? Mark immediately stood up and raised his pistol. Stay here, he said. Ethan followed him nervously toward the back hallway. The storage area door was slightly open. Mark pushed it slowly. Inside the storage room, boxes were scattered on the floor. One of the shelves had fallen over. Ethan pointed. Look. A back door stood slightly ajar. Mark's stomach dropped. That door was locked earlier. Something had forced its way inside. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from behind the shelves. Ethan froze. A figure slowly stood up from the shadows. An infected worker. Still wearing a supermarket uniform. Its mouth was covered in dried blood. And its eyes immediately locked onto them. Ethan whispered in panic. Oh no. The infected lunged forward. Mark fired instantly. The gunshot echoed through the store. The infected collapsed to the floor. But the sound was already too loud. From outside the supermarket, a horrifying chorus of growls began rising. Dozens of infected were now turning toward the building. And they were coming. Fast. Mark looked toward the front of the store. Through the glass windows, figures were already approaching from the street. More and more of them. Drawn by the gunshot. Ethan's voice shook. They heard us. Mark tightened his grip on the pistol. Yes, he said quietly. They did. And outside the small supermarket in London, the infected were beginning to surround the building. For the 5 survivors trapped inside, the real fight for survival was about to begin. At 12:40 p.m., the government of London issued an emergency alert across the entire city. Citizens were told to stay inside and avoid all contact with infected individuals. But what they didn't reveal was that the outbreak might not have been an accident. Inside the dark supermarket, the survivors could hear the infected gathering outside. Slow footsteps dragged across the pavement. Low, disturbing growls echoed through the street. Every now and then, one of them slammed into the barricaded door. Thud. The wooden shelves blocking the entrance rattled slightly. Claire tightened her grip on her daughter. The little girl buried her face into her mother's chest. Mom. I'm scared, she whispered. Claire gently stroked her hair. It's okay. We're safe here. But even she didn't believe those words anymore. Across the room, Sergeant Mark Collins carefully peeked through a small gap between the shelves. At least 20 infected were now wandering outside. More were slowly arriving from the neighboring streets. Drawn by the gunshot earlier. They're surrounding the building, Mark said quietly. Maria sat on the floor, staring at the dark windows. How many more of them are out there? Mark shook his head. I don't know. Dr. Amelia Hart sat behind the counter with Ethan, the university student. Ethan was holding his phone, desperately trying to get a signal. But the network kept dropping. Then suddenly, his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. I got something. Everyone looked toward him. What is it? Mark asked. Ethan opened a news broadcast that had just been released online. The screen showed a government emergency press conference. A serious-looking official stood behind a podium. Behind him was the flag of the United Kingdom. The official spoke with a calm but tense voice. Citizens of London, please remain inside your homes. Avoid all contact with individuals displaying aggressive or unusual behavior. Emergency services are responding to the situation. Maria frowned. That's it? But Ethan scrolled further down. There's more. He opened a leaked article from a private news source. The headline made Amelia's heart sink. Possible biolab connection to London outbreak. Amelia leaned closer. What does it say? Ethan read quietly. The infection may be linked to an experimental viral study conducted at a government laboratory outside the city. Mark stepped closer. Experimental virus? Ethan nodded slowly. It says the project involved neurological virus research, designed to enhance brain activity and survival responses. Amelia's eyes widened. That's impossible. Ethan kept reading. The virus was reportedly being tested under strict containment. But sources claim a breach occurred earlier this week. The room fell silent. Maria whispered, "You're saying the government caused this?" Amelia shook her head slowly. "We don't know that for sure. But deep inside, she had a terrible feeling. The symptoms matched too perfectly. Extreme aggression. Rapid infection. Brain activity continuing even after death. It sounded exactly like something that had been engineered." Suddenly, the emergency broadcast on Ethan's phone changed. A loud alarm sound played. A new message appeared on the screen. Emergency alert. Everyone moved closer to read it. The message read, "Due to a rapidly spreading biological threat, the government has declared a state of national emergency." Claire covered her mouth. "Oh my God." The message continued. "All citizens in London must remain indoors immediately. Military forces are being deployed to contain the outbreak." Outside the store, a distant sound echoed through the sky. Helicopters. Mark walked toward the window. Above the buildings, several military helicopters were flying toward the city center. "They're finally sending the army," he said. But Amelia didn't look relieved. Instead, she looked worried. "Containment doesn't always mean rescue," she said quietly. Mark turned toward her. "What do you mean?" Amelia hesitated before answering. "In outbreaks like this, containment sometimes means preventing the infection from spreading at all costs." Maria stared at her. "You mean they might?" Amelia nodded slowly. "They might lock down the entire city." Outside, more infected were gathering near the supermarket. Some were hitting the windows. Others simply wandered in circles. The barricaded entrance began shaking again. Thud. Thud. Ethan looked at the group. "So what do we do now?" Mark took a deep breath. "If the military is coming, we need to reach them." Claire looked toward the door. "But how do we get out there?" Mark glanced at the growing crowd of infected outside. Then he looked toward the back hallway. "There might be another way." Amelia frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark pointed toward the storage area. "There's an alley behind this building." Maria stood up. "You think we can escape through there?" Mark nodded. "If we move quietly, maybe." But none of them noticed something happening outside the store. Across the street, several infected had suddenly turned toward the sky. The sound of helicopters had attracted them. More infected began emerging from nearby streets. Dozens. Then hundreds. Slowly filling the neighborhood. And the survivors inside the small supermarket in London had no idea that the outbreak was already far bigger than they imagined. Because the city was no longer just infected. It was collapsing. By 4:30 p.m., the government officially declared London a quarantine zone. All bridges were closed. All trains were stopped. But for the millions of people still trapped inside the city, it was already too late. The sky above London had turned dark with smoke. From the rooftops, the city looked like a battlefield. Helicopters circled overhead. Military vehicles rushed through the streets. And sirens echoed from every direction. But none of it was enough. Because the infection had already spread too far. Across the city, thousands of infected now wandered through the streets. Some moved slowly. Others chased the terrified survivors trying to escape. Cars were abandoned everywhere. Several buses had crashed into buildings. And the once busy roads of London were now filled with chaos. Inside the supermarket, Mark and the others prepared to leave through the back alley. The sounds outside had grown worse. More infected were gathering near the building. The barricade at the front door wouldn't last much longer. Mark checked his pistol. "All right," he whispered. "We move quietly. Stay close together." Claire held her daughter tightly as they approached the back door. Ethan slowly pushed the door open. The narrow alley behind the building looked empty. For now. Trash bins were scattered along the walls, and the wind carried distant screams from somewhere in the city. "Let's go," Mark said. The group stepped carefully into the alley. For the first time in hours, they were outside. But the city they stepped into no longer felt like home. The streets were eerily silent. Smoke rose from several buildings in the distance. And somewhere far away, gunfire echoed through the air. Maria looked around in disbelief. "This can't be real." Amelia stared toward the skyline. "I think the entire city is collapsing." Above them, a military helicopter flew past. A loudspeaker message echoed through the streets. "Attention! This city is now under emergency quarantine. All civilians must seek immediate shelter." Ethan laughed nervously. "Shelter? From what?" Before anyone could answer, a growl echoed from the end of the alley. Everyone froze. A group of infected slowly stepped out from behind a parked truck. Then another group appeared from the opposite direction. Mark raised his pistol. But there were too many. Dozens of them now surrounded the alley. Their pale eyes locked onto the survivors. Slowly. They began moving closer. Claire held her daughter tightly as tears filled her eyes. "Mark." He didn't answer. Because he already knew the truth. The outbreak had grown beyond control. The military couldn't stop it. The police couldn't contain it. And the city of London had officially fallen. As the infected closed in, the group prepared for the fight of their lives. Because this was no longer just an outbreak. It was the beginning of the apocalypse.